There's a 6-month shuffle in RV parks. So it's called the RV shuffle. And a new law was passed in California for Imperial Beach in San Diego County that prohibits evicting tenants at 6 months. Under the claim of needing to clean or to do maintenance, and then letting them move back 2 days later. And the reason RV parks were doing this was to maintain a transient status of the renter, so that the renter had no residential tenancy protection as a resident of the state. And in Canada, in British Columbia, they tried to install a 6-month limit on RV campgrounds because they were considered temporary living quarters. But the local park, the RV parks, protested, and the local city officials had to make a public statement that they would never enforce this 6-month shuffle in that city of and then they actually got an ordinance passed that says they have a right to long-term living in the RV park. So just like in Imperial Beach, San Diego County, California. And so there was a professor cited in the San Diego County case where she is an attorney who set up a tenants or a housing rights center at University of San Diego. And so I emailed her about the six-month shuffle, and I said, well, this should work in reverse for people who own land, who have an RV. Why can't they just move out of their land for 2 days and then move back, and then they'd be able to live on their land year-round, even though otherwise it would be considered temporary quarters. And so, for example, there's a guy who was in the movie Nomadland, and his name's Bob Wills, I think, and he's famous on YouTube as a RV um, or car dweller, or what they call houseless. But he interviewed a fellow who bought land, and he has this RV, but then on his land he has a shed that he lives in, but the shed's on it doesn't have a foundation, it's on skids. And so he had to get a temporary variance, a conditional user permit that lasts 1 year, and he has to renew it every year because he's living in a temporary structure for 6 months on his land, and then the rest of the year he leaves and then lives in a RV park, or on public land, RV, Bureau of Land Management, freedom camping as it's called. But the irony is that if he had just stayed in his RV, he could live in his RV for 6 months without a permit on his land if he didn't have the shed. But if he was practicing the 6-month shuffle, then he could just leave his land for a couple days and then come back, and that would be starting another 6 months based on what was already occurring. And in fact, there was a couple of news reports on YouTube. There's like three or maybe 4 local news stories in Imperial Beach, San Diego County, about these RV tenants that they were protesting. They got organized by a local activist group to protest their possible these ongoing evictions that were too expensive for them to keep up with, because every time they have to move out, they have to throw out their food because they have to turn everything off and they can't store their food, and then they have to buy restaurant food or whatever to eat for a couple days, and there's a lot of extra expense for moving. It costs like $300 every time they move. And one of the comments in the news section was that, well, they shouldn't complain because every RV park has that 6-month limit. And but what got me interested in this issue is during the pandemic, the governor of my state, he made a declaration that if you were living in an RV campground as your permanent residence, then you did not have to leave, because of the pandemic. You could stay to make sure you stay, isolated or whatever. And that really piqued my interest, because I'm like, well, wait a second. If it's a campground, how can it be a permanent residence? Because Well, I mean, based on the rule, the definition of an RV is that it's a temporary living quarters. It's the equivalent of a tent, like a tent. And in order to have a permanent residence, you have to have facilities to for like sewage and for cooking and cleaning up, taking a shower or whatever. And so anyway, I actually emailed like maybe, I don't know, a dozen RV campgrounds in my state, and I asked them if they allowed permanent residency, and nobody responded. Not well, actually, one RV campground responded, and they said they did allow it, but they were right by a native Indian reservation, and that had to make me think, well, I mean, of course, if you're living on a reservation, then you're going to have different residency rules, and so then I discovered somebody did some academic paper. I don't know if it was a PhD thesis or something. I have it linked on my blog, but basically, they argued that there's an increase in RV campers, and that they need to have this long-term option. There needs to be a long-term situation for campsites, for camping, because it's like the only affordable housing or shelter that people have in a growing population because of the housing crisis, and that's worldwide now, but it's really bad in the U.S. So, and of course, unfortunately, it's going the opposite direction, where you have the Supreme Court saying that you can make it illegal to camp in public property, and so that's a whole other situation I'm not going to get into right now. But the thing is that if you own land and you're allowed to camp on your land, and most, it depends on where your land is, but if it's like a sort of agricultural land or non-public land that's not developed, like a forest or agricultural, they usually will allow seasonal camping, like RV. And the problem is that it gets tax assessed as recreational camping, which requires you to have other land somewhere else that's a permanent residence with facilities. And when I'm pointing out in this video that in these two cases of British Columbia, Canada, and San Diego County, or Imperial Beach City, where there's like 3 or 4 RV parks, RV campgrounds. They have now made it legal to camp year round, or as a resident for your residency, as a permanent residence. And if they can do it there, then they should just change it for the whole country, for anybody who's able to, who can camp long term. It should be allowed if they own the land or if they're renting somewhere that provides camping. Because otherwise they're forced to move and be evicted, and they live under the threat of eviction with no tenant rights. And this can happen to anybody, even if they own their own land. They could get evicted by the government. And so I had never heard of this 6-month shuffle, but I was wondering about it because ever since I had heard, and then I didn't know that the movie Nomad Land was actually based on a book that started out as a magazine article for Harper's, and I had no idea that the Amazon business was relying on RV workers, and they call it camper force, where people are, they literally hire people because they are camping out in RVs. And so they're able to be transient workers. And so, if people need the option of being, having an address that's not transient, they should be allowed to do it as a campsite, because that's how people lived for thousands of years. People camped. That's how they lived. So they should be allowed to legally camp as their shelter for legal residency, permanent residency, instead of it being considered just seasonal, recreational. And the irony is that in Canada they already allow it, and then when they tried to adopt what's the standard in the US as a 6-month limit, then the government of Canada had to backstep and say, oh, no, we would never enforce this, and we would never, if people are living without any problems, then we want that to continue because we don't want them to be homeless. And that's like the irrational, that's like the rational attitude about this situation, is that if you're camping and that's your permanent residency, then you should be allowed to do that legally instead of being evicted every 6 months and trying to figure out what to do and being fined for camping or whatever. And so I'm glad to see the issues being addressed, and I applaud the efforts of the Imperial Beach RV campers and I want to, congratulate them on securing their rights to residency, and also the Canadians in British Columbia. And I've noticed that, if you're working in an agricultural, doing seasonal work, then you're allowed to camp without needing any kind of permit. And if you're like a herder, the herders are able to camp legally without a permit. And basically they just take a long vacation back to their country, because it's assumed that they are immigrants, migrant workers from other countries, because the work is so hard and low pay that they rely on hiring migrant labor as farm work from outside the U.S. So anyway, that zoning, or that ordinance, their code or tax status, it's more of a tax assessment as seasonal recreational, should be changed to consider that a lot of the people camping out are actually workers. They're low paid workers, and they're just trying to survive, And even if they own the land, that doesn't mean they're not working, because you can farm your own land or do some other kind of work on your own land. And so if you camp out on your own land, that doesn't mean you're doing it for recreational purposes. And so you should be able to do that year round. So then the question is about the sewage and, what's year round for facilities. And so I addressed that in my previous video, so I'm not going to talk about that in this video. My previous upload goes into the issue of sewage for what I consider to be the solution to that problem. Of course, there's the issue of access to water, but that depends on your situation. There's a lot of different approaches to that, and it should be, a case-by-case situation based on what the individual can do. That's up to them to figure it out. It shouldn't be illegal, to live, just to be able to live, to be poor, live off the land. And of course we need single room occupancy housing. We desperately need what's called SROs, as quote room units. And that's essentially what a campsite is. It's a quote room unit instead of a dwelling unit. They'll call it a camp unit. But in the cities, they need these, single room occupancy to solve the homeless crisis. And anyway, that's all I'm going to say. I'm really glad to see that the the 6-month shuffle is being addressed, and that there was a new law in California signed by the governor Newsom, and I'm not sure why it had to be a state law when it only applied to Imperial Beach City, but anyway, I know they want to expand it. The RV campgrounds, they consider that. The tenants consider it a great victory, and they want to expand it to the whole county and maybe the whole state, and then the whole U.S. It can start like that. So, anyway, that's all I'm gonna say about this for now. But I find it really fascinating that that it's even an issue, and there's research about this globally also, because you have these similar kind of codes in Australia and the UK, and it's considered, the United Nations, they're considering it, the 6-month limit, it goes against on the basic human rights of the right to housing and the right to not be evicted. Illegal evictions, it's considered an illegal eviction, and I have research on that. So, thanks.